recently qualified for UCD. So my talk is going to be just around what it's actually like when you get in a course. My experience is that you spend years and years trying to get on a course, but you're not actually sure what it's going to be like until you get on it. So I'm hopefully going to address some of those issues today. I'm going to try and keep it as brief as I can and as informal as I can. There should be loads of time at the end for kind of more specific questions. So I'm going to talk a bit about myself at the start, just talking about what I found helpful in terms of getting on a course and what was helpful once I was on a course. So I did my undergrad in UCD, and one thing that I was kind of conscious of doing was trying to take clinically relevant modules. So what that means is just kind of exposing yourself to some of the stuff that clinical psychologists will actually do. So some of the modules there would be kind of applied psychology, clinical psychology, that type of thing. Just looking at things that a clinical psychologist does. I don't think that looks bad on your CV, but as well it kind of gives you an idea of what you might actually be doing when you get on a course and seeing if that actually is for you. You know, it might not be for everyone. In terms of my undergrad master's or undergrad thesis, again I tried to do something clinically relevant. So I looked at the relationship between adolescent concerns and academic stress and just seeing how those two factors kind of correlated amongst young people. During that time I also tried to get as much kind of voluntary experience as I could. So that would have been at the start stuff like volunteering with St. Vincent de Paul and then moving into an ASD service and just kind of picking up those little bits of clinical experience. Again, they look good in the CV, but they'll just kind of point you whether in the right way, whether that is for you or whether a different branch of psychology might be for you. I knew after doing my undergrad I didn't want to go straight into a master's, so I took a year and began working in a preschool for children with a variety of special needs, stuff like ASD, ADHD, global development, that type of thing. I kind of worked there for a year, which I found to be really helpful in terms of taking those kind of theoretical skills that you've been learning for the past 3 or 4 years and just kind of applying them in a more clinical context, just kind of seeing what that feels like and whether it kind of fits for you. I then applied to do my master's here, so I did the applied psychology master's here. Again, the reason that I picked this is because it's clinically relevant. I kind of keep coming back to that, but I think it's really important to look at kind of making those choices in terms of your early career before you get on a course. What can you do that is relevant towards getting onto a clinical course or being a clinical psychologist? I knew about the Masters that it had the option to take some kind of clinically relevant modules, so stuff like the counselling skills module that I did here I found really, really helpful. I still kind of use some of those skills in my day-to-day work. Another good thing about the course here is that it allows you to work part-time during it. So I was able to continue working in the preschool, and then towards the end of it I was able to take on a post as a rehabilitation assistant in Redwood Extended Care Facility, which kind of works with adults with acquired brain injury or intellectual disabilities, all of which are challenging behaviour. So you can kind of see that the kind of work experience that I was kind of building up, it kind of becomes more and more clinical the more kind of training that I got. Again, for my thesis, I wanted to be clinically relevant, so an opportunity arose to evaluate a cognitive behavioural therapy program for individuals with psychosis. I found this to be a really good experience. It allowed me to conduct semi-structured interviews with individuals with psychosis, as well as conducting standardised quantitative measures. So again, really, really clinically relevant, allowed me to develop research skills as well as clinical skills. I then took another year and began working full-time in Redwood, where I kind of continued to develop clinical skills. And I think probably learned most of my clinical skills before I got onto the course there. Really positive things that I'd say about it was that there was a strong psychology department there that rewards seeking out different opportunities to develop your clinical skills. I think it's a really important point that if you're in a job or if you're looking for a job, to look at what your responsibilities are actually going to be and where you can kind of seek out new experiences. That may be in an AP role, it may just be in an assistant role, it may be in any kind of a role, but just looking to see what your actual responsibilities are. There's been a lot of talk about assistant psychologist positions, I won't go into it here, but some places that are offering assistant psychologist posts, it's an assistant psychologist title, but you may not be doing assistant psychologist stuff. Just have a look at what that stuff is. The role I was in wasn't assistant psychologist, but I was able to work alongside clinical psychologists. I was able to do some staff training. I was able to be a key worker. I was able to do a lot of stuff that an assistant psychologist would do. So I think that's really, really important. Just to, if you're in a job, just kind of explore and see what other opportunities are out there. After working in Redwood then, I applied to get on the UCD program and was accepted onto that. So my main experiences in UCD, I'm going to talk about some of the other courses, but I'm kind of more confident talking about the UCD course. So I'm going to talk about the structure and the format of it. I talk to people who are on the Limerick course and I talk to people who are on the course here, so I can talk about some of the similarities and differences. But as you'll probably see, there's kind of more similarities than there are differences. So each course is 3 years long, and they're divided between placement, block, and research days. So I think UCD is the easiest one to explain that one. Each year in UCD is split between 6 weeks academic block, 4.5 month placement, 6 week academic block, and a 4.5 month placement. So the academic block is basically teaching, where you get kind of the course team or external psychologist will come in and teach you about the stuff you'll be using in your next placement. So if you've got an adult placement coming up, your academic teaching is going to be on adult personality assessments, adult cognitive assessments, that type of thing. For UCD, you're on placement 4 days a week. So generally you work Monday to Thursday and you take Friday then as a research day. So that means you're not in college, you're not in placement, you're just spending that time doing research, ideally, kind of working on your thesis or case study or whatever is due at that time. So as I said, UCD do 6 placements. In first year you do 2 child placements, ideally 1 CAMS and 1 primary care. Second year you do 2 adult placements, possibly 1 adult mental health and 1 primary care, but ideally at least 1 adult mental health. Third year then you do an ID placement, and then that's followed by a specialist placement. So this is something that all the courses offer. They offer you the chance to do a placement in basically any service that you can think of and apply to when you're successful in getting on. So I did mine in an inpatient adolescent unit. Other people have worked with eating disorders. Definitely in UCD there's the opportunity to go abroad for that placement as well. So it's worth kind of thinking about it here. It's kind of early, but it's always worth thinking about what you're kind of interested in, because the really popular stuff does fill up soon. Trinity is largely similar in that you do 6 placements, which are roughly the same amount of time. The order of their placements is different though. So in first year you do 2 adults, and then in third year your first placement is a child, then 4th, 5th and 6th placement is intellectual disability, child, and then your specialist. Although the order then can kind of change. I think that's a really positive thing. It means that if 2 people from the one course want to do the same elective placement, they can kind of move them around so that they can both do that. The key difference between Trinity and UCD is that, well, in UCD you're on placement 4 days a week, and then your Friday you usually use your research day. In Trinity you're in college every Monday, whether you're on placement or not. And then you've got kind of a half day somewhere in the week to be doing research. So that's the kind of key difference. In UCD, when you're on placement, you're not in college, whereas Trinity you're coming in every Monday. Limerick's then is different. So Limerick does 4 placements rather than 6. It does 1 child, 1 adult, 1 intellectual disability, and then 1 specialist placement. Similar to Trinity, you're in Limerick most Mondays. So it's a 4-day placement, but you're in Limerick kind of most Mondays. Because they only do 4 placements, their placements are longer. I think there's definitely a big advantage for that in terms of it allows you to do some more kind of long-term work. Particularly when you're working on therapy, you can see someone for kind of 6 months. There's a definite advantage to that over seeing someone for kind of 3.5, 4 months, which UCD and Trinity would offer. So it kind of swings around a bit between the 2 really. So then once you get on a course, or once you're kind of on placement, what you do is very much based on your logbook. So each university has their own logbook, but they're basically the same. Basically sets kind of minimum criteria that you have to meet in order to pass your DPhil. So for the UCD logbook, you have to meet 80% of your logbook requirements. So this is just kind of taken from the adult part of the UCD logbook. So you can see there's a really wide range in terms of what kind of psychological difficulties you might have to encounter, and as well as your kind of age ranges. Ideally, you'll see inpatients and outpatients, and then you can see someone from an individual from an ethnic minority group. So as I said, UCD say you have to meet 80% of your criteria, so there is a bit of flexibility, but at the end of the day, it comes down to each student's responsibility that you have to meet your logbook requirements. Your supervisor will be aware of them, so usually what happens is a week into your placement, you, your supervisor, and your logbook kind of sit down and look at how can we kind of meet 80% of these criteria. Just one important point about that is that you can see the age range stops at 65. In Ireland we don't do, or there isn't an older adult core placement in any of the courses. If you want to do an older adult placement, you can do it as your elective. We don't specifically have an older adult placement. However, you have to see a certain amount of older adults, and that's in a separate part of the logbook. So it's not somewhere that you're going to be necessarily working, but on your adult placement you're kind of looking to meet as many kind of older adults as you can, and there's going to be a minimum amount of people that you have to see there. So the logbook is quite good in terms of specifying just what kind of testing you have to do as well. So you've got kind of minimum of kind of 6 weights, 6 wins, you've got personality assessments, rating scores, that type of thing. Kind of looking at that, it does look like a lot. But I guess if you think if you're going to do a neuropsychological assessment, you're probably going to do an intelligence test, you're probably going to do an MD test, so you're already kind of marking a few off there. Similarly, if you're going to do depression inventory, you're probably going to do one pre, mid, and post. That's going to be 3 anyway. So you do kind of work through it, and it's a handy template to work on. And it does mean that when you're halfway through a placement, you and your supervisor can kind of look at it and say, well, actually, I'm not meeting my criteria. I really need to step up my assessment side of things or my intervention things. So it is kind of there as a support. What that actually looks like then is, or what I've tried to do is just kind of set up what a typical working week would look like. Now this isn't your first week by any means. This is kind of when you're in a couple of weeks, like your first week on placement is generally a lot of reading, a lot of getting to know policies, hopefully observing your supervisor, that type of thing. This is when you're kind of in it a couple of weeks. So I've highlighted in yellow the kind of clinical time, that kind of one-to-one or face-to-face time you have with clients. One of my supervisors said that a really good rule of thumb is that for a trainee, 20 to 25% of your time should be based on, or should be kind of clinical time. Which I think is a really good rule of thumb, and it kind of, when I kind of worked it out there, it does kind of fit with what a typical working week would be. So you've got there, this is a kind of an ideal week. You've got a wide range of psychological problems, you've got a personality test, you've got an intake assessment, and you've got group as well as individual work. So that just kind of gives a broad idea of what's going on. I also think it's really important just to point out that what I've tried to do is give loads of time for stuff like prep, so preparing for supervision, preparing for sessions, loads of time for kind of reflecting on particularly difficult sessions, or reflecting on what a supervision session is like. If when it comes to being on a course and you feel that there isn't that time for preparation, there isn't that time for reflecting, then really there's kind of an ethical obligation on you to call that with your supervisor. If you're finding that you're kind of overloaded, and 99% of supervisors won't do it, but if you find that you are being overloaded, it's just about calling it. I'm just going to say, look, I could really do a little bit more support here so I can deliver the best possible interventions that I can. So as I said, there's differences between the various courses. However, what they have in common is basically you have a minimum of 390 placement days. So for UCD, that's 665-day placements. For Limerick, it's 4 nearly 100-day placements. And then you have to see a minimum of 60 clients over the 3 years. So again, UCD, that's 6 clients per placement. Limerick is 15. So even though the courses are kind of based differently, those kind of minimum criteria are kind of set in stone for all of them. Okay, so what I've done is, so as I said, this is UCD week, so you've got Friday as your study day. Just as an aside, there's personal therapy there. You have to go to a minimum amount of personal therapy hours, kind of varies slightly by course. So kind of your study day is kind of a good day to do that. But the other thing that you're doing on your study day is working on the multitude of assessments that's kind of thrown at you. So these kind of vary between courses, but you kind of, there's kind of 4 or 5 types that you do. So for UCD, you do 3 case studies. So that's kind of it's a case study. It's looking at what type of work you've done with a certain individual, looking at your assessment, your formulation, your intervention, and then kind of evaluating that. In UCD, you do 4 essays, so 1 child, 1 adult, 1 IT, and 1 on your specialist placement. And then a change that they've made this year that I really like is you do a systematic review. So previously you did a meta-analysis, which was terrible. But now you do a systematic review, which is based on what your thesis is going to be on. So it's a really good way of kind of linking those two, and ideally that systematic review will form a chapter in your thesis. And you also do a small-scale research project. Again, they've changed it this year, so hopefully that will be a chapter in your thesis. So it's kind of linking the whole thing together, which I really like. Trinity is kind of similar. You do 5 case studies, so 1 for each of your placements. And my understanding is that you present them to other years, so it's kind of good learning in that. You do a small-scale research project in first year, and then in first and second year you have an essay and an exam. And then UL, kind of similar. You do 3 case studies, and you do 3 essays, and then you also do a small-scale research project. So they're kind of similar. And then if you have any energy left, you then have to write a thesis. So certainly with UCD, and certainly in my year, your thesis is based on your geographical area. So I was sponsored by the South East, so mine was based in Waterford. UCD guidelines provided it, that it was a minimum of 25,000 words. That might have changed, they've changed it to a PhD program now, but 25,000 is a good kind of rule of thumb anyway. I guess the advice I would give around this is in rocket science, it's about starting it early. We were quite lucky in that we got ethics through pretty quickly. We were amazed at how long that collection took. And just the logistics behind it and any possible roadblock you think will come up over the 3 years. So I would say start it early. I would say to anyone who is applying to get on a clinical course this year, start thinking now about what are potential thesis proposals that you could come up with. I have heard people who've been asked in interviews, and it's absolutely no harm at all to have some ideas. You might be working on a piece of research now that might possibly be expanded into a DPhil thesis. You might just have an idea, you might have read something, but it's absolutely no harm at all to start thinking about it. Particularly when in UCD you're already going to be writing your systematic review in the first year. It's no harm before all the madness of the interview start to just be start thinking about it now. Just to give a little idea about what a DPhil thesis might look like. So, as I said, I was based down in Waterford, so myself and another guy in the course looked at, we did the Waterford mental health study. So what that involved was conducting a fairly comprehensive assessment with a large number of outpatients and inpatients. That would involve a full diagnostic interview for Axis 1 and 2 disorders, a measure looking at retrospective accounts of childhood abuse, measure of family functioning, a global assessment of functioning, a measure of service needs, so a wide number of assessments. We kind of had assistant psychologists as well, which kind of helped with that. From that then, Mark took the data set and looked at the relationship between personality disorders and retrospective accounts of childhood abuse, whereas I looked at that measure of family functioning, factor analysed everyone's scores on it to see whether that was a measure that could or should be used with adults attending mental health services. So there's a really broad range. I know people in my class, some of them did mixed methods, some of them did qualitative, some of them did quantitative. Throughout every course, there's going to be a wide course team that all their interests are different, so that kind of idea of any kind of methodology is going to be fine, no matter what course you're in. So that's just to bear in mind if you are thinking about putting some kind of a proposal together in your head and looking at what kind of methodology might work and what has worked previously. So look, that's a complete whirlwind tour of what was kind of a whirlwind 3 years. I've probably been very general, but if people have specific questions and we have time for questions, Yeah, we can have them at the end or we can have them there, whichever. Okay, good, I have a slide for that. Okay, then I'll turn it over to questions and applause. Yeah.
I'm just wondering about like the interview process and stuff. Like, I've kind of read up a little bit on the psychology club in UCD, but like, is it really bad? Like, is it really intense?
No, it's not. It's not. It is intense, but it's not horrible. My experience at UCD was that they really try and put you at ease. Certainly, when I did the interviews, we were kind of told, look, we know that you know how to do stats. We know that you know about psychological theories. What we're going to do is we're going to conduct a couple of interviews that are actually going to have the same questions, because then we'll be able to see how you are best at answering those questions rather than taking a snapshot of you when you're really, really stressed. So basically, you go in, I went in, there was 2 people, they asked me 4 questions, they tell you what the questions are going to be, and then you go out and you kind of breathe again, and then you're called in by 2 different people and they ask you the same questions, and you give pretty much the same answers. So that's what UCD is, and they really, really try and put you at ease. I know for other courses they have exams, and they're a bit more intense, but like, we all know how to do exams. We've all been doing, and if you got onto a program, you know how to do an exam. So it is intense, but it's not horrible. And they don't, it's not in their interest to make everyone really, really anxious and really, really frenetic, because then you're not going to get the best people. They do try and relax you as much as they can.
Yeah, so is it just that, it's not just that one meeting, I have to do like an essay first and something, and then we see a panel, and then...
For UCD, anyway, you do your application form,
Yeah.
which is probably available online now, and then they call you in, they ask those those questions, and then there's a second round where there's a bigger panel, so there's maybe 8 people and 3 of them ask you questions. But definitely usually there's no essay or anything like that.
Thank you.
I imagine you're fairly unusual that you got in the first time you applied, because I've heard obviously it's hard. So what do you think it was that set your application apart from the rest of them that got you in straight away?
Apart from my outstanding talent. It's a good question. I think probably the fact that a lot of people when they go for interview, they have the same experience. They have their clinical experience, they have their research experience, they have their academic record and stuff. But I think maybe what I think worked for me was that I'd actually reflected on each of my experiences. So when I moved from job A, what did I learn in job A and how did I apply that to job B? When I left job B, what was I looking for? Why did I leave that job? You know, was it because I was finished there, or was it just because something else kind of shinier came up? So I think that's probably the most important piece of advice I can give is start thinking about what your kind of story is and what your narrative is. And if you can kind of show that and kind of show that you've really thought about your experience and that you're not just kind of going for this course that everyone else is going for it, you're going for it because it's the next kind of logical step. I think that's kind of really important. Yep.
So you said that you took a year out after undergrad, which I'm doing as well at the moment. Something that I found is that you feel a bit daunted coming out, like you're just freshly graduated with no real experience. And I want to make the most use as I can out of this year by getting clinical experience as well. I have research experience at the moment, so I'm just wondering how you approach people in terms of getting clinical experience with no previous experience.
I think for me, I was kind of lucky. I just kind of happened to be talking to someone, and there was kind of a job that was there. I think it's about kind of looking at, you know, when you say you've no clinical experience, I'm sure at some point that you kind of dealt with some kind of vulnerable people, or you've dealt with children, or you kind of dealt with something along those lines, and kind of looking at to see, well, how is that kind of clinical? And then I think it's about kind of being as honest as you can and saying, look, you know I don't have a whole lot of clinical experience, but my academic record is this, and I have really good research experience, and that, you know, exposed me to a certain kind of population. And I think when you're honest, that maybe your supervisor can kind of support you in that way, because I think it's really important that if you don't have that much clinical experience, that you're not kind of having to do too much too soon, if you know what I mean. In terms of kind of getting your foot in the door, that's always kind of the most difficult, but your second job is always much easier to find than your first. Yeah.
What was the best and worst part of your clinical training?
Wow. The worst part was definitely the first week. It's very daunting when you go in, and I think it's daunting because you don't know a lot of this stuff. You don't know what it actually involves, you don't know how difficult it's going to be, and then it's the same when you go on placement. It's just kind of difficult because it's kind of a first day and that type of stuff. But that's just kind of something that's just going to happen, and you kind of get through it. The best part of it was the first time that I actually did one-to-one therapy with a client and saw that it had a really good effect. It's kind of hard to put across just how brilliant that is. You can kind of lose sight of why you're trying to get on a course sometimes, and actually when you do it and you actually see you can make a difference, it does make all the kind of slog worthwhile. I'm going to take one more.
Okay, it's a short. I was going to ask, what age are you?
I'm 28. I love 12, but I'm 28. And there was someone younger than me on my course as well.
Really?
Yeah. Okay, come on, hand you over to Dr. Dalton. Thanks very much.
I wish I'd known all that. I don't have any slides prepared. I was thinking as Kevin spoke there that the idea of the narrative said, you know, about having our own story about why we want to do this and being really clear about that. I think it's probably one of the most important things. And I couldn't agree most people in the room are probably reasonably well positioned or qualified to start a clinical training program. What happens at interview is what comes across at interview is someone's preparedness, someone's maturity, psychological maturity, and their understanding of their own process and story. So what's brought me to this point? And it doesn't need to be pretty, or it doesn't need to be complete or whole. But the idea that we have an idea of our motivation and of our intention or motivation. Why do I want to do this? And I suppose I often kind of think at some level, clinical psychology in particular has kind of become, for some people, the kind of holy grail. It's kind of, what lots of people seek to do after an undergraduate degree. Certainly if they're interested in working directly with people, clinical populations or distressed populations. So that worries me a little bit because I kind of think, we can end up pursuing something because through some sort of collective unconscious, it has become the holy grail. And it's not. It's hard work. So I think that's something to be really cognizant of, to really be very clear about your own motivation. And if that motivation is clear, that will come across an interview really quickly, actually, really quickly. And after years of interviewing people in all sorts of different situations, it's really something that you pick up on pretty instantly, actually. So most of us will tick the boxes, and that additional piece is clarifying the motivation. And I think one of the really important ways to do that, to pursue a career in clinical psychology at this point or prior to interview, is where possible to do some personal therapy. And of course, that costs money, so I'm not naive to think that you can just do that tomorrow morning. But I think as a way into clinical psychology, I think it's a really important piece of work to do for oneself, to clarify the intention, and to get to learn and to know how I can tolerate my own psychological distress. Because the bottom line is if you can't tolerate your own psychological distress, you can't tolerate someone else's. So you're wasting your time. You're wasting your time as clinicians. The woman I worked with many years ago in the drug service said, we can only bring people in therapy, at least, we can only bring people to where we've been ourselves. We can only bring people to where we've been ourselves. Now, of course, I'm not talking about experiences here, because there's lots of experiences that patients have had that I would never have, and can never have. But at an emotional, psychological level, we can only bring people, we can only walk with people where we have walked ourselves. And that's a big ask. It's a big ask at a young age. But therapy is a real benefit in getting to know that landscape, getting to know, do I have the capacity to sit with my own distress? And if I do, well, I'll probably be pretty good at sitting with other people's distress. So, yeah, not the holy grail. Person therapy has been really important. Management work. On Friday, with varying degrees of success, has generally been a day, the post that I have, very lucky, the post that I have as a teaching and research committee, which tends to be which I kind of try to put into a Friday. So it's allowed me to do really nice teaching in UCD, mainly in UCD and here in Trinity, mainly in clinical programs, but simply undergraduate medical and nursing programs, and research. We've a couple of really big, well, in relative terms, research projects that I've been looking after. A large RCT has come to an end, and various other bits and pieces, so trying to pull that together. Making time for my own supervision and my own therapy, because the work I think necessitates that, and very difficult to do without it. So that's kind of how the week looks, more or less, until recently, and then I started with the UCD half-time, so it's all been flipped to the head. So I work in Vincent's half-time until kind of Tuesday or Wednesday morning sometimes, and I work in UCD and pulling together some of the research and looking after a master's program in language research and having some dedicated time to write and to think. The clinical environment is a very, as people will know, it's a very challenging environment. It's always on. So lunchtime, coffee time doesn't exist. There's smells and bells, and it's 24/7, and everything is infection control. And UCD is very different, so that contrast is very nice. I'm very welcome at this point. We over the years, for probably as long as I've been there, a couple of years before me, we've been teaching mindfulness to oncology patients and dermatology patients through St. John's Wood with the dermatology department. So that happens normally twice a year. We run an outpatient mindfulness training program, 8 weeks to a month for 8 weeks. And we do that twice a year, normally in kind of October, November, and then kind of February, March, depending on the students. And we tend to do that in the evening, towards the evening. And then once a month there's a monthly mindfulness group that we do training. Working in a hospital, in a huge adult hospital environment is I don't know if I did that. And in my training, I didn't actually work in psychiatric hospital, psychiatric facilities in an acute hospital, but never in an acute hospital. I love it. It's a very stimulating environment where there are lots of possibilities in terms of research, collaboration, and teaching. And most of us will have spent probably 10 years in university before we work as clinical psychologists. And I often think it's a shame that we sometimes then, as clinical psychologists, end up handing up a lot of our other skills, like our fantastic research skills and a lot of teaching skills that we recruit along the way. And sometimes we kind of lose those. I think that's a real shame. It's been my great pleasure and privilege in the last year to be president of PSI, and so to provide some kind of leadership for our professional body, representing close to 3,000 psychologists in a whole range of areas, clinical and teaching, research, and a whole range of areas. So it's been a real privilege to get to know how psychology is working in Ireland on the ground, and probably to have a sense of what that's going to look like in the years to come. To hear a little bit more closely from people in terms of what we need, the product, the project that's required in our health services, for example. And having a little think about projecting out in terms of what's that going to look like in the next 10 years, and being able to ready yourselves for that in some way. I think one of the big problems with clinical psychology is that it places a disproportionate emphasis on the internal life of the person who sits in front of us who is distressed. So we're inclined to think, oh, that person's psychological distress is the result of something funny going on here or here, yeah? When in fact a significant amount of psychological distress is the result of the society that we live in, the inequalities, the vast inequalities that exist in our society, that all the talking and therapy in the world is not going to change. There are some colleagues in the UK who are doing some work with, under the kind of banner of equality is the best therapy, that may not be, that the reach of psychotherapy is actually quite limited when we live in a society that is so unequal, and there are large parts of society that are utterly disadvantaged. So psychology, in some ways, has been used as a sticky, as a plaster. I believe that. And I believe that psychology, and I believe that clinical psychology in particular, not in particular, I believe that clinical psychology has a particular role to highlight the social origins, the inequality origins of mental health difficulty. So if we're not doing that, I don't really think that we're doing our jobs properly. But not everyone agrees with me on that. But I think without doing that, and without us being critically aware of what we're doing, I think we burn out as clinicians. We burn out. It won't sustain us in the same way. But if we're not actively using what we know from our learning, from our research, from our science, if we're not actively using what we know to bring about wider social change, I wonder how sustainable it all would be, to be honest. And the really nice thing is that in clinical psychology, in psychology in general, that there is a history and that there is an openness to begin to consider some of those issues. So, I really want to stress and underline that. It's really important. We've been very focused on the internal journey, the internal process, terribly important, of course, but the science of that for really sustainable answers, I believe. But if it's a career, and I'll finish with that, but if it's a career that you want that is about alleviating human suffering, or what I've kind of said once or twice in the last 12 months, if it's a career that you want to contribute to the human project, clinical psychology is a pretty good one. The human project based on the notion that we're not just as we are because of a project, because of the human beings who are in evolution. If we want to contribute and change that, clinical psychology is really going to do that. Questions?